We have a pretty formidable stack of source material on the table for you
Oh,
today.
absolutely. It's a mountain of paperwork.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at what we're looking at right now, it's extensive. We've got U.S. Army medical discharge papers from 1969, complete with psychiatric evaluations.
Right. And then there's the California Parole Board matrices and internal audit reports from 1990.
Exactly. Plus hundreds of pages of court transcripts from a 1994 capital murder trial and, raw, highly detailed forensic and crime scene reports.
It's an incredible archive to dig through. And when you synthesize all these documents, what emerges is this very granular, very dark portrait. It's a portrait of both systemic failure and just deep human pathology.
Which really brings us to the mission for this deep dive. We're going to take you through the progression of an offender named Phillip Carl Jablonski.
We are.
And we want to use these sources to understand how an individual escalates. How do you go from domestic abuse to becoming an opportunistic serial predator?
It's a terrifying trajectory, really.
It is. But before we get into the timeline, I need to look you, the listener, right in the eye. This material is incredibly heavy.
Yes, fair warning.
We are not censoring the forensic realities here. We'll be discussing severe domestic violence, sexual sadism, extreme post-mortem mutilation, and paraphilic behavior.
Yeah, the documents really pull no punches, and neither will this analysis.
Right.
But the value in exploring this isn't to sensationalize the violence, it's to dismantle the mechanics of it.
Exactly. Why did this happen?
Right, because based on the criminological reports we have, Jablonski's life serves as this operational case study. It shows how dangerous behavioral markers are they're repeatedly miscategorized.
Or completely ignored.
Ignored by the very institutions designed to protect society.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the geography and the psychological foundation, because these sources point heavily to where he was raised.
They do. The early sociological data centers on his birth, which was January 3, 1946.
And the location is critical here.
Highly critical. He was born in Joshua Tree, California.
Right, and today, we might associate that with national parks or music festivals or whatever.
Yeah, vacations, hiking.
Exactly. But the post-war environment of Joshua Tree in the 40s and 50s was a highly isolated, rugged, really sparse high desert community.
It was incredibly remote.
So what specifically does the criminological report tell us about the environment inside his home? Because, geography is one thing, but the domestic reality is another.
Well, the psychiatric evaluations from his later trials trace back to a household defined by absolute terror.
Wow.
Yeah, the father was a volatile alcoholic, and he utilized severe, continuous physical and sexual abuse against both his wife and his children.
Including Philip.
Including Philip, yes.
I want to stop on that word isolated, because if we're looking at this from a developmental standpoint, does the isolation of the desert actually act as a mechanical factor in how this trauma sets in?
Oh, absolutely it does.
I mean, if you put a pathogen in a biological clean room with no environmental resistance, it just multiplies, right?
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. I mean, sociologically, we look for what are called external nodes of intervention.
What does that mean, practically?
Well, imagine a densely populated urban center in the 1950s. A teacher, a neighbor, maybe a local shopkeeper. They act as a passive surveillance system.
Right, because they're physically closer.
Exactly. They see bruises, they hear screaming through shared walls, and they introduce social friction or even direct intervention.
They call the police or they say something to the mother.
Right. But in the geographic isolation of post-war Joshua Tree, those nodes just did not exist. The family was essentially a closed circuit.
So the violence just becomes the baseline reality for this kid.
It becomes the primary language. When a child experiences that level of multi-generational trauma, it actively rewires their neurodevelopment.
God, that's heavy.
The father's violence normalized physical domination as the default mechanism for resolving conflict and for asserting control.
And because the abuse was also sexual.
Yeah. Because it was sexual and because he witnessed his mother being victimized, the boundaries between physical pain, sexual gratification, and power were completely obliterated in his developmental blueprint.
And this is where the terminology in our source material gets highly specific. I'm looking at the psychiatric reports here, and they refer to this as the incubation of paraphilic sadism.
Yes, a very distinct clinical term.
Right. So for the listener who isn't a forensic psychologist, What is the mechanical difference between standard aggression and paraphilic sadism?
Well, standard aggression is usually reactive.
Like getting into a bar fight.
Exactly. It's a response to a perceived threat, a loss of temper, or maybe a means to achieve a practical goal like taking someone's wallet.
Okay, so a means to an end.
Right. But paraphilic sadism means the psychological and sexual arousal is intrinsically dependent on inflicting suffering, physical or psychological suffering on another person.
So the pain isn't a byproduct of the act?
No, the pain is the objective. That is the point. And in Jablonski's case, the seeds of that pathology were planted in a closed-circuit environment where literally no one told him it was wrong.
Which means when he finally leaves that closed circuit, he takes that pathology with him into a completely different structural environment.
He does.
According to the military records we have, he enlists in the United States Army in 1966.
Right. He joins the military during a period of intense conflict. He ends up serving 2 tours of duty as a sergeant in the Vietnam War.
But the military framework ultimately ejects him. I'm looking at his discharge papers from 1969 right now.
And what do they say?
Well, the specific official reason for his discharge is listed as a schizophrenic illness.
Ah, yes. That 1969 diagnosis.
Right. Now, the natural assumption when someone comes back from 2 tours in Vietnam with a psychiatric discharge is combat trauma, what we'd classify today as PTSD.
That would be the logical leap for most people, yes.
But the sources really differentiate this, don't they?
They do, and it is a crucial distinction for you to understand. We have to look at the diagnostic mechanisms of military psychiatry back in 1969.
Which were probably pretty flawed.
Oh, completely rudimentary. At that time, the tools for differentiating severe combat fatigue from, say, organic personality disorders or latent psychosis were just not there.
So they just slapped a label on him.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
The military recognized that his psychiatric structure was disintegrating, but the combat environment didn't necessarily inject him with violence out of nowhere.
It just poured gasoline on what was already there.
Exactly. The intense stress, the adrenaline, and the lethal environment of Vietnam likely acted as an accelerant. It accelerated the paraphilic and psychotic predispositions that had been incubating since his childhood.
So the military realizes he is fundamentally unstable, they label it schizophrenia, and they just discharge him.
They do.
They're essentially just releasing him back into the civilian population without any long-term containment.
And the immediate aftermath of that release is where we see his violent ideations transition.
Right.
They go from internal pathology to active interpersonal victimization.
Let's follow the timeline into those relationships, because the transition back to civilian life is immediate and it is destructive.
Very much so.
In 1968, while he's still tied to the service and stationed down in Texas, he marries a woman he knew from high school. Her name is Alice McGowan.
And the behavioral reports from this specific period are very revealing.
What do they tell us?
The reports regarding his marriage to Alice McGowan document the crystallization of his modus operandi, his MO.
The choking.
Yes. The violence wasn't just generalized domestic battery like hitting or shoving. It was highly specific. He utilized respiratory obstruction.
God.
During sexual intercourse, he would strangle McGowan until she lost consciousness, or he would attempt to suffocate her using pillows.
I mean, why respiratory obstruction? In the spectrum of violent behavior, what does controlling someone's breath actually accomplish for an offender with his specific psychological profile?
It is the ultimate mechanical execution of power. Think about it. When you control a person's airway, you are controlling their life force on a second-by-second basis.
Right. You hold their life in your hands.
You are deciding in real time whether they exist or expire. For a paraphilic sadist, this provides an immense psychological high.
Because it mirrors his childhood.
Precisely. It mimics the absolute physical domination he witnessed and experienced as a child. But now, he's the one in the dominant position.
He's playing the role of his father.
Exactly. Fortunately, the records indicate Alice McGowan eventually fled the marriage. She saved her own life.
But his response to her leaving isn't, reflection. He doesn't go get help.
No, it's simply target replacement.
Right. So the timeline moves to November 1968. He meets a woman named Jane Sanders, and the police reports indicate that on their very first date, he rapes her.
But she stays with him.
Yeah, they actually moved to California together in July 1969, right after his discharge.
The dynamics of why she stayed are incredibly complex. They're rooted in the intense intimidation and coercive control he exerted.
Which I imagine authorities in the late 60s didn't understand at all.
Not even a little bit. It was unfortunately very common and poorly understood by law enforcement back then.
Hmm.
But what we really need to focus on is the escalation in his methodology during his time with Sanders.
Right, because the violence evolves. It's not just his hands anymore.
No, it's not. According to the victim statements, there was a specific incident where Sanders attempted to withdraw consent during intercourse.
And how did he react?
Jablonski's reaction was to introduce a weapon into the sexual assault. He produced a firearm, explicitly threatened her life, pistol whipped her until she was unconscious, and then proceeded to rape her.
Wow. So we are moving from manual strangulation to blunt force trauma with a deadly weapon.
The threshold for what he needs to do to achieve control is rising.
Jane Sanders does manage to flee in 1972, thankfully, but this is the point in the timeline where the victimology shifts dramatically.
A huge shift.
Up until late 1972, he is terrorizing intimate partners, women who know him, who are in his home.
Right, that is the boundary of domestic violence. But in late 1972, the police reports document a home invasion.
He targets a female acquaintance this time.
Yes, he breaks in and rapes her at knife point.
And the detail in this police report that absolutely stops you cold, and I had to read this twice, is that he committed this knife point rape while the victim's infant child was in the room.
It's chilling. And if we evaluate that detail from a behavioral perspective, it reveals a profound lack of situational empathy.
It's a complete disregard for collateral damage.
Entirely.
It almost feels like a deliberate display of invulnerability, right? Like he doesn't care about witnesses. He doesn't care about the psychological damage to the child. It's just pure narcissism.
It is a critical escalation marker. He is abandoning the requisite of an established relationship to justify or facilitate his violence.
He doesn't need to be dating them anymore.
Exactly. He is hunting. And this incident finally led to his capture and his first significant criminal conviction for rape.
But a conviction for rape in the early 1970s did not keep him off the streets for long.
Unfortunately, no.
Let's move to the next phase of his escalation. We are now in 1977. He meets a woman named Linda Kimball in February. They move to Palm Springs, California, and they have a daughter together in December of 1977.
So the domestic cycle resets.
It does, but it takes a very bizarre psychological turn before it ends in tragedy. The source material details an incident on July 6, 1978.
The mother-in-law incident.
Right. Linda Kimball's mother, Isabel Pauls, lives nearby. Jablonski breaks into Isabel's home in the middle of the night.
He wakes her up and explicitly states his intention to rape her.
But he stops, and according to his own statements, the reason he stopped is that when he looked at Isabel, he claimed he saw Kimball's face.
This is a fascinating and just terrifying psychological mechanism. It's called projection.
Yeah, how so? Walk us through that mechanism.
Well, to a neurotypical person, Linda Kimball and Isabel Pauls are two distinct human beings with their own autonomy.
They're a mother and a daughter.
Right. But to Jablonski, women were not individuals. They were interchangeable avatars for his hostility.
Just objects.
They were blank canvases onto which he projected his need to dominate. The fact that the mother and daughter blurred together in his mind during an assault signifies something crucial.
That the identity didn't matter.
Exactly. The specific identity of the victim was entirely secondary to the power dynamic he was trying to enact.
That is just wild. Well, Isabel Pauls manages to escape. She alerts her daughter, and Linda Kimball does exactly what you're supposed to do, right? She packs up her baby, she leaves Jablonski, and she moves in with her mother.
But as we know, leaving is notoriously the most dangerous moment for a victim of domestic terror.
It triggers the ultimate loss of control for the abuser.
Yes.
So, on July 16, 1978, Linda returns to the apartment she had shared with Jablonski. She's just there to pick up some baby supplies.
It's a completely mundane errand.
Just grabbing some things. But Jablonski is there, and the forensic report from this crime scene marks his total transition to murder.
The coroner's report details an extreme, multimodal assault.
He beat her, he stabbed her, and he strangled her.
He used every violent skill he had developed over the past decade.
On the mother of his child, he goes on the run after this, but law enforcement catches him 11 days later. And this is where we have to look really closely at the court transcripts and the legal documents from 1978.
The legal outcome is baffling.
He is charged, and he pleads guilty to second-degree murder, assault, and attempted rape.
And for a premeditated, brutal murder involving blunt force, edged weapons, and strangulation.
Committed by a man with a prior rape conviction and a military psychiatric discharge.
The court hands down a sentence of 12 years.
12 years. This is the part of the source material that just demands an explanation. We are looking at a clear, documented escalation from manual strangulation to armed rape to multimodal murder.
A textbook escalation.
How does the California justice system in 1978 look at that forensic reality and land on a 12-year sentence? I mean, what was the mechanical failure there?
It requires us to understand the landscape of criminal justice prior to the widespread integration of behavioral science.
It was the Wild West.
In a way, yes. In the late 1970s, the concept of serial escalation and the specialized threat assessment of paraphilic sadists were largely confined to academic circles.
Or like specialized federal units, like the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit.
Exactly. They had not filtered down into state-level sentencing guidelines or standard prosecutorial matrices.
So the judge and the prosecutors, they were just looking at the charge on paper, not the trajectory of the human being standing in front of them.
Precisely. Plea bargains were heavily utilized to clear dockets. The system functioned on a purely transactional basis.
Move the cases through the pipeline.
A guilty plea for second-degree murder saved the state the cost of a trial. And in exchange, the defendant received a fixed, relatively low sentence.
So the court evaluated the crime in a vacuum.
Yes, ignoring the blindingly obvious behavioral markers that indicated he was a permanent threat to society.
Unbelievable. So the system mathematically processes him and sends him to San Quentin State Prison to serve his 12 years. We are now in the 1980s.
And the idea that prison acts as a deterrent or a place of isolation is completely shattered by what he does next.
Yeah, the prison records show that while incarcerated, Jablonski takes out a personal ad in a newspaper seeking a romantic relationship.
The compulsion to hunt and acquire targets does not stop at the prison gate.
And someone answers. A 46-year-old woman named Carol Spadoni living in Burlingame, California.
She initiates correspondence with him.
She knows he is an inmate at San Quentin. She knows he is serving time for murdering his previous wife. And despite all of this, in 1982, she marries him in a ceremony inside the prison.
There is an entire psychological subfield dedicated to understanding this. Why individuals seek relationships with convicted violent offenders.
Hybristophilia, right?
Yes, hybristophilia. But if we keep our focus squarely on Jablonski, this marriage represents his incredible ability to manipulate.
He secured a victim from inside a maximum security environment.
It's his way of keeping the cycle primed.
But he doesn't just manipulate from the inside. He continues to act out violently, and the incident that happens in 1985 is perhaps the most critical psychological red flag in this entire stack of documents.
The visitation room assault.
Right. In 1985, Jablonski's mother comes to visit him at San Quentin.
During the visit, in a fully monitored environment, he attacks her.
He attempts to strangle his own mother with a shoelace.
If we trace his behavioral architecture back to its foundation in Joshua Tree.
The desert.
Right, the environment where his hostility toward women was forged in the presence of his mother. This moment is the absolute epicenter of his pathology.
It's a direct strike at the source of his trauma. But mechanically, how does the psychological evaluation process an attempted matricide in a prison?
In clinical terms, attempting to murder the primary maternal figure using his signature method of respiratory control demonstrates a pathology that is entirely unmanageable.
It proves that his violent impulses supersede any environmental deterrent.
Exactly. If he is willing to garrote his mother in a room surrounded by armed guards, he possesses zero behavioral inhibition.
None. Which brings us to a systemic failure that just defies logic. I am looking at the California Board of Prison Terms documents from 1990.
Here we go.
Despite the 1972 rape, despite the brutal 1978 murder of Linda Kimball, and despite attempting to strangle his own mother inside San Quentin in 1985, wait, I can't even say without getting mad, the parole board grants Phillip Carl Jablonski parole in 1990.
They did.
And the justification listed is good behavior. I need you to explain the matrix here. How does a parole board mathematically calculate an attempted garroting of a mother inside a prison as part of an overall profile of good behavior?
It's stunning. The internal audits from that era reveal a catastrophic reliance on bureaucratic checklists over clinical risk assessment.
Checklist.
Yes. The parole matrices of the late 1980s and early 1990s heavily weighted compliance with daily prison routines.
Like what?
Did the inmate maintain their cell? Did they attend assigned work details? Did they avoid gang infractions?
So they're measuring his ability to act like an inmate, not his ability to act like a safe citizen.
Exactly. Furthermore, specific acts of violence, if they didn't result in a new, separate felony conviction that extended the sentence, were sometimes compartmentalized
As what, like a demerit?
as localized disciplinary infractions rather than indicators of systemic psychological danger.
Right.
They treated the shoelace incident as a rule violation rather than a screaming neon sign of paraphilic sadism.
They just swept it under the rug. The bureaucracy blinded itself to the monster.
And by doing so, the state of California legally permitted a highly volatile predator back into the public sphere.
And the timeline from 1990 to 1991 moves incredibly fast.
Because the incubation period is over, he immediately transitions from fantasy back to active hunting.
He is paroled to the Indio Desert area, returning to the geographic environment of his youth. Now, the parole board did impose one specific geographic restriction on him.
Yes, he is explicitly banned from traveling to Burlingame, California.
Because that is where his wife, Carol Spadoni, resides with her 72-year-old mother, Eva Peterson.
Right. Over the course of his incarceration, reality had finally set in for Carol Spadoni.
The correspondence must have revealed his true nature.
It did, because the parole records show she was deeply fearful of him by this point. She actively contacted his parole officer and stated unequivocally that she did not want him living with her or knowing her exact whereabouts.
So he is geographically restricted, openly rejected by his spouse, and placed back in a desert environment. This just creates an enormous accumulation of psychological tension.
He attempts to blend in at first.
Yeah, the records show he enrolls in automotive classes at a local community college in the Indio area.
And the witness statements from his fellow students describe him as very intelligent.
And he had a habit that seemed completely innocuous at the time. He carried a cassette tape recorder and recorded all of his classroom lectures.
But beneath that student persona, he's preparing.
Mid-April 1991, he approaches a classmate named Jim Lawrence, and he purchases an RG-14 revolver and ammunition.
The acquisition of a firearm is the threshold event here.
It's the point of no return.
It signifies the shift from passive ideation to active intent. He's arming himself, which means he has selected a timeline for his violence.
That timeline begins on April 22nd, 1991. And the victimology here represents a complete departure from his previous patterns.
He's not attacking an intimate partner.
No. He targets a woman named Fatima Van. She is 38 years old. She is a fellow student at the community college, and she is a recently widowed mother of 2 teenage girls.
She is a victim of pure opportunity and proximity.
Jablonski abducts Fatima Van and takes her out into the remote expanse of the Indio Desert. The crime scene reports from this murder detail a level of violence that is just difficult to process.
It's horrific.
He sexually assaulted her, he shot her in the head, but the post-mortem actions are what really dominate the forensic analysis.
The mutilation.
Yes. He physically removed her eyes and her ears, and he used a blade to carve the phrase, "I love Jesus," into the flesh of her back.
We need to break down the mechanics of this scene, starting with the sensory organs.
What does removing the eyes and ears signify in an investigative profile? Like, why take that extra step?
In forensic pathology and behavioral profiling, the post-mortem removal of sensory organs is a heavily loaded signature.
Okay.
It is an attempt to permanently silence the victim's perception.
Even though she's already deceased.
Yes, even though the victim is deceased, the killer's pathology cannot tolerate the idea of being observed or judged. By removing the eyes and ears, he is dehumanizing her completely.
Stripping away her humanity.
He's reducing her to an object that has been stripped of his capacity to perceive him. It is absolute psychotic control over her physical form.
And then we have the carving. I love Jesus. When a killer introduces religious iconography or text into a scene of extreme sexual sadism, how do psychologists categorize that? It feels like a massive contradiction.
It is classified as a mission-oriented delusion or a psychological buffer.
The buffer against what?
Against his own actions. Jablonski is engaging in acts of extreme depravity, and cognitive dissonance requires him to rationalize his actions to himself.
So he uses religion.
Exactly. By cloaking the mutilation in religious text, he displaces his guilt. He creates a twisted narrative where he is a vessel of a higher power or a righteous entity rather than just a sadistic predator.
It is a grandiose delusion designed to protect his own ego from the reality of his crimes.
Precisely.
The murder of Fatima Van shatters whatever restraint he had left. The bloodlust doesn't satiate him, it accelerates him.
Within 24 hours.
On April 23, 1991, Jablonski blatantly violates his parole conditions. He gets in his car and drives north toward Burlingame. He is heading straight for the women who rejected him.
He arrives at the residence on Sanchez Street, and the resulting double homicide crime scene is one of the most chaotic and complex environments investigators had ever encountered.
Let's walk through the forensic reality of that house, starting with 72-year-old Eva Peterson.
The mother-in-law.
Right. The crime scene photos and coroner's reports show she was found in the kitchen. Jablonski utilized a folded towel, which he pushed incredibly deep into her mouth as a makeshift gag.
Again, the respiratory obstruction.
He then fired his revolver directly through that towel into her head.
But he didn't stop there.
No. The report notes she was found naked from the waist down. He had stabbed her in the neck while she was still alive. He subjected her to post-mortem sexual assault. And he engaged in further mutilation, cutting her nipple and slicing the skin near her right eye after she was deceased.
The terminology for this is necrophilic sadism.
It's just beyond comprehension.
The need for control is so absolute that it extends beyond the moment of death. He requires the victim to be an utterly compliant object so he can enact his paraphilic fantasies without any resistance whatsoever.
And while this is happening to Eva in the kitchen, his wife, Carol Spadoni, is in the living room.
She is found in a nightgown.
And this is where his lifelong obsession with respiratory control reaches its peak. He doesn't use his hands or a pillow this time. He takes heavy duct tape and wraps it incredibly tightly over her nose and mouth to suffocate her.
But the physical mechanics of the assault create a bizarre and horrifying medical paradox.
Right. While her face is bound in duct tape, he stabs her deeply in the throat. The coroner determined that this stab wound inadvertently acted as a functional tracheotomy.
It's a profound irony.
He stabbed her with lethal intent, but the blade opened an airway in her trachea below the duct tape. This allowed her to continue drawing breath.
The instrument of her intended death temporarily bypassed his mechanism of suffocation.
Realizing that she's still alive and breathing through the wound, he shoots her behind the right ear, executing her, and then stabs her 3 more times in the abdomen.
It's a complete frenzy of violence.
But amidst all of this chaos, Jablonski introduces a mechanical element that changes the entire nature of the investigation.
The tape recorder.
He brought the same cassette tape recorder he used in his automotive classes into the house on Sanchez Street. And he turned it on.
He recorded the double homicide.
He graphically narrated his own actions, the shootings, the stabbings, the sexual assaults, the mutilations, in real time.
I have to ask you about the function of this.
Yeah.
We talked about how the high of a paraphilic murder is fleeting.
Yes, it dissipates quickly.
Is this tape recorder essentially an external hard drive for his deviant fantasies?
That is the most accurate mechanical analogy you could use. For a sadist, the physiological and psychological release of the murder peaks and then rapidly drops off.
Right.
By recording the audio of the victim's suffering and his own narration, he is capturing the data of his dominance.
He can keep reliving it.
He is creating a highly specific, customized auditory trophy. This allows him to replay the event on demand, continually re-stimulating that psychological high long after the physical act is over.
So the documentation is just as vital to his pathology as the murder itself.
So he leaves the house on Sanchez Street. He has murdered 3 women in 2 days. He has mutilated them. He has recorded the audio to take with him. He is armed, he is mobilized, and he initiates a massive interstate flight across the western United States.
And this flight phase provides a real-time stress test of his forensic profile.
2 days later, April 25, 1991, he has crossed state lines into Wyoming. He pulls into a rest area in Uinta County.
And he spots a woman named Yvette Shelby.
He makes the decision to attack. He approaches her and brandishes his RG-14 revolver. But then he makes a massive mechanical error.
A critical failure in his execution.
He fumbles the gun and drops it on the ground.
Yvette Shelby seizes the moment.
She runs, she escapes, and she immediately flags down law enforcement.
Yeah.
The police respond to the rest area. They actually locate Jablonski, who is still there.
Astonishingly.
They intercept him and they question him about the woman's report of a man with a gun. And what does Jablonski do? He completely changes his demeanor.
He puts on a performance.
He smoothly tells the officers that it was a huge misunderstanding, that the gun simply fell out of his car door when he opened it, and it must have startled the woman.
He is calm. He is rational.
And the police accept his story and let him drive away. We have to look at the psychological blind spots in that interaction.
It's a glaring oversight.
Please explain it, because when you read this, it makes you want to pull your hair out. How does a man who is frenzied enough to carve words into a victim's back 2 days prior suddenly possess the composure to beat a police interrogation on the side of a highway?
It comes down to the difference between an investigative interview and a situational patrol stop.
Okay, what's the difference there?
The officers in Wyoming didn't know they were talking to a serial killer. They thought they were responding to a panicked civilian at a rest stop.
Right, they had no context.
Jablonski utilized what we call surface compliance. Highly manipulative individuals know how to mimic the baseline expectations of an authority figure.
Just act normal.
Exactly. He spoke calmly. He offered a plausible environmental excuse, the gun falling out of the door, and he didn't challenge their authority. He utilized the situational norms to make himself invisible.
He showed them exactly what they needed to see to close the call.
And it highlights his mixed behavioral profile. Dropping the gun is highly disorganized, but pivoting instantly into a calm, rational lie to deceive law enforcement is a highly organized, complex cognitive function.
And because he beats that interaction, he just keeps driving east. 2 days later, April 27, 1991, he is crossed into Grand County, Utah.
He pulls off Interstate 70 in a place called Thompson Springs.
He targets an isolated business. The co-owner is a 58-year-old woman named Margie Rogers. Jablonski enters the store, he robs the register, he sexually assaults Margie, and he shoots her twice in the head. Her body is discovered later by her husband.
If we track the timeline here,
It's insane.
April 22nd in Indio, April 23rd in Burlingame, April 25th in Wyoming, April 27th in Utah. 4 murders and 1 attempted abduction across 3 states in 5 days.
But the velocity of his flight finally catches up with him. The interstate alerts are broadcast, the vehicle descriptions are matched, and on April 28, 1991, law enforcement successfully intercepts and apprehends Phillip Carl Jablonski in Kansas.
The physical threat is finally neutralized. But the legal and psychiatric battle over his culpability is just beginning.
Let's move to the court transcripts. The trial mechanics begin, and Jablonski's defense team mounts the only strategy available to them, given the overwhelming physical evidence.
They enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
And they build their entire framework on that 1969 military discharge paper. They argue that the schizophrenic illness diagnosed by the Army proves his mind has been fundamentally broken for decades,
rendering him legally insane.
We need to clearly define the mechanism of a legal insanity defense here.
Right. Insanity is a legal term, not a clinical psychiatric diagnosis.
So it's about his state of mind at the exact moment of the crime.
Exactly. To meet the standard, the defense must prove that at the time of the crime, the defendant suffered from a severe mental disease or defect that prevented them from understanding the nature and quality of their act, or from distinguishing right from wrong.
So having a history of schizophrenia or personality disorders does not automatically grant you legal insanity.
No, it does not.
They have to prove he didn't know what he was doing when he was wrapping the duct tape or pulling the trigger.
Correct. The prosecution had to prove that despite his bizarre and gruesome actions, he possessed localized, momentary awareness of his crimes.
In November 1993, a jury evaluates his psychiatric state and formally finds him competent to stand trial.
The criminal phase proceeds, focusing specifically on the murders of Carol Spadoni and Eva Peterson in Burlingame.
In April 1994, he is found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. But the trial then shifts to the sanity phase.
This is where the defense tries to save him from death row.
But the prosecution introduces the very item Jablonski created to memorialize his power.
The audio cassettes.
The tapes from the Sanchez Street house.
This is where the mechanics of his own pathology destroy his legal defense.
How so?
The jury sits in the courtroom and listens to the audio of the murders. They don't hear a man suffering from a disjointed schizophrenic break.
They don't hear a man hallucinating or disconnected from reality.
No. They hear a predator graphically and lucidly narrating his own actions in real time.
Dictating his methodology.
Exactly. The tapes provided undeniable, empirical evidence of premeditation, acute situational awareness, and an absolute lack of remorse.
He documented his own sanity.
He did.
On May 10, 1994, based heavily on the mechanical evidence of those tapes, the jury officially finds that Phillip Carl Jablonski was legally sane during the commission of the crimes.
A month later, on June 17, 1994, he is sentenced to death.
He is returned to death row at San Quentin, the very prison he had been paroled from 4 years earlier.
He remains there as his sentence is repeatedly appealed and eventually upheld by the California Supreme Court in 2006.
Finally, the records show that on December 27, 2019, Jablonski dies of unknown causes on death row at the age of 73.
It's the bureaucratic conclusion to a decades-long cascade of violence.
When we pull back and look at the entirety of these source documents, the discharge papers, the court transcripts, the parole matrices, The case of Phillip Carl Jablonski stands as a monumental warning.
It maps the precise trajectory of paraphilic escalation.
But more importantly, I think the documents expose the fatal mechanics of institutional failure.
Without a doubt.
A 12-year sentence for a multimodal murder because of plea bargaining norms. A parole board that reduced an attempted matricide to a minor behavioral demerit.
A patrol stop that let a murderer drive away because he mimicked compliance.
The systems repeatedly failed to recognize the behavioral data until the body count became impossible to ignore.
It demands that our investigative, judicial, and correctional systems integrate sophisticated behavioral science into their daily matrices. We cannot rely on surface compliance or outdated administrative checklists to identify predatory threats.
I want to thank you, the listener, for sticking with us through this deep dive. We know examining the raw mechanics of these crimes is taxing.
It is heavy material.
But understanding how an offender operates and how the systems fail to stop them is the only way we can recognize the cracks in our own societal foundations and demand better threat assessment.
Before we close the file on these sources, I want to leave you with a specific paradox from the trial to think about.
Okay, let's hear it.
We established that the jury found him legally sane, primarily because his own cassette tapes proved his lucid awareness.
Right, he proved it himself.
But consider the alternative scenario. What if Jablonski hadn't possessed that narcissistic compulsion to build an auditory trophy?
Oh, wow.
If those tapes didn't exist to mechanically prove his state of mind, would the defense have successfully used his 1969 military schizophrenia diagnosis and the sheer bizarre brutality of the crime scenes to shield him from the death penalty?
That's a terrifying thought.
It forces us to ask a difficult question about our legal mechanisms. Does our justice system inadvertently favor the silent, unrecorded monsters while only punishing the ones who are arrogant enough to boast?
That is a mechanical flaw in the system worth losing sleep over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take these concepts, apply them to the world around you, and we will see you on the next one.